It's August 17th, 2026. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you're doing great wherever you're tuning in from today. So there's a small coral island sitting in the northern Persian Gulf that most people couldn't find on a map a year ago. And right now it's sitting at the absolute center of whether the Iranian economy survives the rest of this year intact. 90% of everything Iran sells to the outside world funnels through this one island, and the United States Navy just made sure almost none of it is moving the way Tehran needs it to move. Here's what we're covering today. What actually happened at Kharg Island over the last several weeks, why 3 tanker berths that used to load supertankers around the clock have been sitting completely empty, the Hellfire missile strikes that have taken multiple tankers out of commission before they ever reached Iranian waters, the oil spill that pushed the island's storage system dangerously close to the breaking point, and why Tehran is now scrambling through the Caspian Sea and quiet anchorages near Larak Island, trying to smuggle crude out the back door because the front door has effectively been slammed shut. So stick around, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why this single island matters more to Iran's survival right now than almost anything else happening in this conflict. Let's start with the basics, because you need to understand exactly what this place is before you can understand why choking it off is such a devastating blow. Kharg Island became Iran's primary crude oil terminal and loading facility back in the 1960s, and by the 1970s, supertankers were docking there directly instead of using the older port facilities at Abadan. The island itself contains massive oil storage facilities connected by pipeline directly to Iran's largest oil and gas fields, and it hosts 3 main pieces of energy infrastructure, including the Falat Iran Oil Company, which on its own produces roughly 500,000 barrels of crude oil every single day. The island sits about 26 kilometers off Iran's mainland coast, roughly 483 kilometers northwest of the Strait of Hormuz, and it has a storage capacity of about 30 million barrels. Think about that number for a second. 30 million barrels of storage capacity sitting on one small island, because for decades, this was simply where Iran's entire oil economy funneled through, no matter how much crude the country pulled out of the ground elsewhere. By the mid-2020s, the terminal had grown to the point where it could load 10 supertankers simultaneously, and much of what left the island headed straight for China, which remains the largest crude importer on the planet, and where Iranian oil has accounted for something like 11.5% of China's total seaborne crude imports so far this year alone. If you sat down and tried to design one single choke point capable of bringing the Iranian economy to its knees, you genuinely could not design a better one than Kharg Island. It's small, it's isolated, it's completely dependent on open water access, and there is functionally no alternative facility anywhere close to replacing what this island does for Iran's export economy. It's also worth remembering this isn't the first time the island has been targeted. Back during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, Iraqi forces hit Kharg Island's oil terminal repeatedly, and Iran was forced to temporarily shift its shipping operations to smaller facilities at Lavan Island and Siri Island while repairs were carried out. So this vulnerability isn't new information for Tehran. They've watched this exact scenario play out before, decades ago, and they still never built a genuine, scalable alternative. So let's talk about how we actually got to this moment, because this didn't happen through one single dramatic strike. This has been building in stages for months, and understanding the sequence matters if you want to understand why the current blockade is proving so effective. Back on March 13th of this year, the United States Air Force conducted a massive bombing raid on Kharg Island, targeting more than 90 separate Iranian military sites, while deliberately avoiding any damage to the oil and gas infrastructure itself. Those strikes hit military targets specifically, including storage facilities for submarine mines and missile batteries that Iran had been using to threaten shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. But the actual oil terminal came through completely untouched. President Trump described the operation in his own typically colorful terms, saying the strikes had totally obliterated every military target on what he called Iran's crown jewel, and calling it one of the most powerful bombing raids in the history of the Middle East. He also reportedly threatened to strike it a few more times just for fun, which tells you the psychological pressure campaign was running alongside the physical one from the very beginning. But here's the important distinction, and it's worth sitting with for a second, because it explains everything that came afterward. That first strike wasn't designed to destroy Iran's oil exports outright. It was designed to strip away the military teeth Iran had stationed on that island, the mines, the missile emplacements, the assets that let Tehran threaten commercial shipping lanes, while deliberately leaving the actual economic engine of the island intact. Satellite imagery taken days after that bombing run actually showed the terminal continuing to operate as an export hub, with 3 tankers still moored there loading cargo. That was strike 1, and it was a message about capability and restraint, not a decision to pull the trigger on Iran's export revenue. Strike 2, so to speak, didn't come from a bomb at all. It came from a threat, and it landed just as hard. Back in June, President Trump issued a direct warning that the United States intended to hit Iran very hard and specifically seize Iran's energy base on Kharg Island, writing publicly that at some point in the not-too-distant future, the U.S. would be taking Kharg Island and other oil infrastructure points and assuming total control of their oil and gas markets. He went even further in an interview with the Financial Times, saying flatly that he didn't believe Iran had any real defenses left on the island at all, and that the United States could take it very easily if it wanted to. That's not standard diplomatic hedging. That's a sitting American president openly floating the idea of physically seizing a piece of sovereign Iranian territory and taking direct control of its energy exports. Now, to be fair, there were serious voices inside the policy world pushing back hard against that specific idea, pointing out that an actual American occupation of the island would put U.S. troops sitting stationary just 33 kilometers off Iran's coast, well within range of whatever drones and missiles Tehran still had left, and that striking or seizing the oil infrastructure directly could provoke even heavier retaliatory attacks on Gulf Arab infrastructure while sending global fuel prices even higher than they already were. There's also the simple economic reality that Kharg Island oil doesn't just matter to Iran, it matters to global markets too, and a full-scale assault on the terminal itself would risk taking a meaningful chunk of global crude supply offline overnight, something that tends to make even hawkish policymakers pause. Trump ultimately walked that specific threat back, at least the part about direct physical occupation. But the message had already landed in Tehran loud and clear, and it set the stage for what actually happened next, which turned out to be a smarter and far more effective play than any ground occupation ever could have been. Because instead of occupying the island, the United States simply decided to strangle it from a distance. And that's exactly what's been happening in the weeks leading up to this video. Let's walk through the actual timeline of the blockade itself, because this is where things get genuinely brutal for Tehran's finances. The United States reimposed a full naval blockade on Iranian ports back in mid-July, after an interim agreement to reopen the Strait of Hormuz that had been under active negotiation completely collapsed. Operations at Kharg Island came to a total halt on July 31st, according to two separate maritime intelligence providers, Kepler and Energy Aspects, both of which track global energy and shipping data professionally for a living. Satellite images reviewed by the Financial Times showed all three of the island's tanker berths sitting completely empty for an extended stretch of time, and at one point only 16 vessels remained anchored in the waiting area around the island, the lowest number recorded since the beginning of the previous month. Think about what that number actually means in practical terms. About 9 out of every 10 barrels of crude oil Iran exports gets loaded specifically at this one small coral island, because much of the country's remaining coastline is simply too shallow to allow large tankers to dock anywhere else. When the berths at Kharg go quiet, Iran doesn't have some easy backup plan waiting in the wings. There's no equivalent facility sitting ready to absorb that volume. As one geopolitics analyst covering the region put it plainly, the blockade is effective in the simplest sense imaginable, because there just isn't much tanker traffic moving in or out anymore, though that same analyst also cautioned that the resulting loss of export revenue wasn't expected to put immediate pressure on Tehran to compromise in ongoing negotiations, which tells you the regime is willing to absorb serious economic pain before it changes its posture at the negotiating table. And this isn't a case of Iran simply choosing caution and voluntarily holding its ships back. The United States Navy has been physically enforcing this blockade with real weapons on real vessels in real time, and the receipts on that are public record. Back in early June, U.S. Central Command confirmed that a fighter jet had fired a Hellfire missile directly into the engine room of an oil tanker heading toward Kharg Island. The vessel, a Botswana-flagged ship called the MT Lexi, had ignored repeated warnings and failed to follow directions from U.S. forces multiple times over a full 24-hour period before American forces finally disabled it. Military officials confirmed the tanker was unladen at the time, meaning it wasn't even carrying oil. It was simply attempting to reach the island to pick up a load. That detail matters, because it tells you the United States isn't just intercepting ships full of Iranian crude trying to leave the country. It's stopping empty vessels from even reaching the island in the first place, cutting off the supply chain at its earliest possible link, before a single barrel ever gets loaded. Then in mid-July, CENTCOM struck again, this time disabling a Curaçao-flagged commercial vessel called the Belma. After it, in the military's own words, ignored multiple warnings as it attempted to violate the blockade. That strike came as part of a broader wave of U.S. operations that also hit Iranian command centers, air defense sites, and missile and drone capabilities, all aimed specifically at degrading Iran's ability to threaten commercial mariners in the Strait of Hormuz. The military also confirmed it had redirected 2 additional commercial vessels within the first 24 hours of enforcing that renewed blockade, meaning the interceptions weren't isolated one-off incidents. They were happening as a matter of routine enforcement almost immediately. Iran's Revolutionary Guard responded to all of this with typical bluster, warning that if the United States kept closing off Iranian oil and gas export routes, the region's energy exports would either be available to everyone or to no one at all. Strong words, sure, but words don't reload a tanker, and right now Iran's own tankers are the ones sitting empty in the water while the threats keep flying back and forth. Now, let's talk about what all of this pressure has actually done to the physical infrastructure on the island itself, because the strain has been showing up in some pretty alarming ways that go beyond just lost revenue. Back in early May, satellite imagery, captured by the Sentinel-1 and Sentinel-2 satellites, picked up a large white and gray slick spreading east of Kharg Island, covering an estimated area between 60 and 70 square kilometers of open water. Business publications reporting on the incident described it at the time as an estimated 80,000-barrel oil leak, and maritime experts warned it represented a genuine ecological tide of no return if it wasn't contained quickly. Iran's own top environmental official pushed back hard on that characterization, insisting the spill was likely caused by a tanker illegally dumping wastewater rather than any actual leak from the island's oil facilities. Maybe that's true, maybe it isn't, but here's the thing that made this moment genuinely dangerous regardless of the exact cause. At the time of that spill, Kharg Island's storage system was already sitting at roughly 74% capacity, and experts studying the facility have pointed out that once utilization crosses around 80%, the entire system starts to become functionally inoperable. Iran had roughly 31 million barrels of effective spare storage capacity left across all of its facilities. Combined at that point, which analysts calculated was enough to absorb somewhere between 17 and 20 days of pre-war production levels before every available tank on the island would be physically full. On top of that, an additional 42 million barrels of Iranian crude were sitting in floating storage on so-called dark fleet tankers near Indonesia. Oil that Iran genuinely could not offload anywhere because the U.S. Navy was actively disabling tankers attempting to move through the strait. When you combine limited storage on land, limited storage floating at sea with nowhere to go, and a naval blockade actively preventing new tankers from arriving to relieve any of that pressure, you get a system that is genuinely at risk of physically backing up on itself, like a bathtub with the drain plugged and the faucet still running. There's a human and environmental dimension to this that's worth pausing on too, because it's easy to only think about barrels and dollars when you're talking about a blockade like this. Reports at the time described toxic black rain falling over Tehran and coastal regions, a byproduct of burning oil depots that had become so corrosive it could reportedly burn human skin on contact, according to warnings from the Iranian Red Crescent. And because tens of millions of people across the Gulf region depend on desalination plants for their actual drinking water, any oil slick large enough to reach those intake pipes threatens to turn what started as a purely military and economic standoff into a genuine regional humanitarian crisis over basic access to clean water. That's the kind of secondary consequence that rarely makes it into the headline numbers about tanker counts and barrel prices, but it's very much part of the real cost of a blockade this prolonged and this intense. And there's a secondary economic crisis playing out alongside all of this that gets far less attention, but matters just as much for understanding how badly this is hurting Iran financially. Every barrel of crude oil that comes up out of the ground brings a certain amount of natural gas along with it, and normally that gas gets captured and either used domestically or shipped out as liquefied petroleum gas. But according to maritime intelligence firm Tanker Trackers, while crude exports from Kharg's terminals have remained comparatively strong during the periods when loading is actually happening, LNG exports specifically have been falling sharply, with the excess gas increasingly getting burned off entirely instead of shipped out for sale. Think about what that means from a pure business perspective. Iran is literally setting fire to a valuable export product because the blockade has made it too difficult or too risky to load and ship it properly. That's not a country operating at reduced efficiency. That's a country burning revenue in real time simply to keep its core oil production running at all, watching money go up in smoke, quite literally, because there's nowhere to safely send it. So here's where things stand as of this week. And this is genuinely the most important development for understanding where this story goes from here. On August 12th, after a 25-day total shutdown, Iran managed to resume loading crude at Kharg Island's western terminal. Satellite imagery showed a very large crude carrier, a massive tanker measuring 333 meters, finally berthed and actively loading for the first time since July 18th. That specific tanker had been sitting offshore waiting since July 11th, more than a month of just floating there, before it was finally able to move into position and start loading. But before anyone reads that as a sign the blockade is cracking, look at the rest of the picture, because it tells a very different story. The island's eastern oil terminal and its liquefied petroleum gas facility both remained completely empty even after that western terminal reopened. And the offshore waiting area still held somewhere between 16 and 17 tankers just sitting there, backed up, unable to load. Maritime intelligence firm Tanker Trackers. Com separately confirmed a national Iranian tanker company vessel loading roughly 2 million barrels of crude at a different jetty on the island, describing it as the first loading activity observed at that specific location since late July. So what you're actually looking at here isn't a reopened terminal, it's a bottleneck with a single needle threading through it. One berth active, one massive tanker loading after waiting for over a month, while the rest of the island's infrastructure sits idle and a growing backlog of ships waits offshore with nowhere to go. Even Reuters, in reporting on this exact development, was careful to note that even a single VLCC loading is an important signal, but it is not proof that normal exports have actually resumed. That caution is worth holding on to, because a single tanker breaking through after a month of waiting is not the same thing as a functioning export economy. And here's a detail that tells you Iran's own oil production has quietly slowed down to match the reduced export capacity, whether by choice or by necessity. Tanker Trackers. Com noted that Iran's current oil production levels appear to be roughly in line with what the country's own refineries are actually processing, plus domestic consumption needs, meaning Tehran may simply not need to export as much crude right now as it used to, because it physically can't move the surplus anyway. That's a country adjusting its entire production strategy around the reality of a blockade. It can't break through conventional means, essentially throttling its own oil field output to match what it can actually get out the door. Rather than pumping crude, it has no way to sell. Now let's talk about what Iran is actually doing to fight back against all of this, because Tehran isn't just sitting there absorbing the pressure passively. Maritime AI company Windward summed up the strategic shift happening right now in one clean sentence, saying Iran isn't waiting for the blockade to lift, it's rerouting around it, and the data backs that up in some genuinely creative ways. At an anchorage point called North Larak, 7 additional tanker and cargo hulls were recorded arriving over just 2 days, pushing the total vessel count there up to 35 as of August 12th, up from 28 just 2 days earlier. Windward's data showed that so-called dark vessels, meaning ships operating without transponders, broadcasting their location, accounted for roughly 74% of that entire cluster, with an additional 10 sanctioned vessels identified moving through the same anchorage. That's an enormous concentration of ships, deliberately trying to stay off the radar, literally and figuratively, all clustering around a single anchorage point that isn't Kharg Island itself, and it tells you Iran is essentially building a shadow logistics network right under the nose of the blockade, one dark tanker at a time. And then there's the Caspian Sea route, which might be the most fascinating workaround in this entire story, because it involves Iran essentially importing help from Russia to keep its own oil economy functioning. Windward's tracking data shows that Russia to Iran wet cargo shipments, meaning tanker deliveries carrying liquid cargo like crude oil or refined products, increased by roughly 2.9 times over a 164-day period, following the initial blockade escalation back on February 28th. That works out to 23 separate shipments during that window, up from just 8 shipments during the equivalent earlier period before the blockade tightened. And it's not just the number of shipments going up, the actual volume has surged too, climbing from roughly 174,000 barrels to approximately 437,000 barrels. Think about the geopolitical picture that paints. 2 heavily sanctioned nations, already isolated from most of the traditional international financial and shipping system, are leaning on each other harder than ever, specifically to keep oil moving around a naval blockade that neither of them can break through direct confrontation. Whether that's a sign of genuine strategic partnership or simply 2 desperate economies grabbing onto whatever lifeline is available, it tells you Iran is now treating its northern border with Russia as a genuine alternative export corridor, something that would have sounded almost absurd as a serious strategy just a couple of years ago, and yet here we are, watching it happen in real time with actual shipping data to track it. Meanwhile, out in the wider Gulf, the broader consequences of this standoff keep spilling into view in ways that have nothing directly to do with Iran's own tankers. Just recently, satellite images reviewed by the Associated Press showed a sanctioned tanker called the Caroline Bazengi, carrying nearly 1 million barrels of oil, grounded and increasingly submerged off the coast of Oman, leaking crude into a protected marine reserve that's home to endangered petrels and the rare Arabian Sea humpback whale. That vessel had been sitting grounded for 2 months by the time those images were captured, a floating environmental disaster tied directly to the chaotic, high-risk shipping patterns this entire blockade has forced onto the region. When you push that much tonnage of oil traffic into dark fleet operations, older vessels, and improvised routes, incidents like this stop being rare exceptions and start becoming a predictable, recurring cost of doing business the way Iran and its shipping partners are now being forced to operate. So let's take a step back and ask the bigger question here. Because all these individual data points, the empty berths, the disabled tankers, The Caspian Sea shipments, the Dark Fleet clustering at Larak, the grounded tanker off Oman, they all add up to one central strategic reality worth understanding clearly. The Strait of Hormuz blockade has severely disrupted Iran's main oil export artery, but it has not completely stopped crude from being loaded or moved through alternative channels entirely. That's the honest, nuanced picture here, and it's worth resisting the temptation to oversimplify it in either direction. This isn't a total, complete shutdown of the Iranian oil economy where not a single barrel moves anywhere. But it's also nowhere close to business as usual. And what you're actually watching is an economy being forced into an increasingly desperate, increasingly expensive, increasingly inefficient set of workarounds just to keep some fraction of its export revenue flowing, while its primary purpose-built export facility sits mostly idle, backed up with waiting tankers, and burning off valuable gas that it can't find a way to ship out properly. Think about what that actually costs Iran, not just in lost revenue, but in operational strain across the entire system. Every barrel that gets rerouted through the Caspian Sea via Russian shipping arrangements or funneled through the North Larak anchorage using Dark Fleet tankers with their transponders switched off comes with added cost, added risk, and added complexity, compared to simply loading a supertanker directly at Kharg Island the way Iran has done for the better part of 6 decades. Dark Fleet operations aren't cheap or simple. They typically involve older, less reliable vessels, higher insurance costs when insurance is even available at all, ship-to-ship transfers designed specifically to obscure the true origin of the cargo, and a constant risk of interdiction by American or Allied naval forces patrolling the region. Every one of those factors eats into the profit margin on every single barrel Iran manages to move. So even on the weeks when Iran technically succeeds in getting oil to international buyers, it's doing so at a steep discount and a steep operational cost, compared to how this system was designed to function in the first place. And this pressure doesn't exist in isolation from everything else happening around it either. Remember, this blockade is playing out against the backdrop of a broader war that's already devastated large parts of Iran's military infrastructure, killed its supreme leader in an American and Israeli strike back in the spring, and left the regime simultaneously fighting a Kurdish insurgency along its western border while trying to hold together an economy that's bleeding money from every direction at once. Every dollar Iran fails to collect from oil exports because a tanker got disabled by a Hellfire missile or because a berth sat empty for 25 straight days is a dollar that isn't available to prop up the currency, isn't available to pay soldiers and IRGC personnel, and isn't available to fund the very military operations the regime is trying to sustain across multiple fronts simultaneously. This is exactly the kind of compounding pressure that becomes genuinely dangerous for a government to manage. Not because any single element of it is unbearable on its own, but because all of it is happening at the same time, against a regime that's already stretched thinner than it's been in decades. So where does this actually go from here? Watch the berth activity at Kharg Island closely over the coming weeks, because that single Western terminal reopening on August 12th is genuinely one of the more important signals to track. If that single tanker loading turns into a sustained pattern of regular activity across multiple berths, that tells you the blockade enforcement may be loosening in practice, even if it hasn't been formally lifted. But if that loading turns out to be an isolated exception, a single ship that had been waiting more than a month finally getting cleared through some negotiated arrangement, while the rest of the island stays quiet and the offshore backlog keeps growing, that tells you Iran is still functionally locked out of its own primary export facility, no matter what the headlines about resumed loading might suggest on the surface. Watch the Caspian Sea numbers too, because if Russia to Iran shipments keep climbing at anywhere close to the pace they've shown over these past several months, that tells you this alternative corridor is becoming a permanent fixture of how Iran does business rather than a temporary emergency workaround. And that has implications well beyond just this current conflict. And watch what the United States decides to do with its remaining leverage here, because the choice not to physically occupy or directly strike the oil infrastructure at Kharg Island was, by every indication, a deliberate decision. One that leaves Washington enormous room to escalate further if it decides that's the right move, while still holding back the most extreme option on the table for now. Because here's the strategic logic that ties this whole story together. You don't actually need to bomb an oil terminal to destroy its usefulness to an adversary. You just need to make it too dangerous, too unpredictable, and too costly for anyone to reliably use it. That's precisely what this blockade has accomplished at Kharg Island. The physical infrastructure is still standing. The pipelines are still connected. The storage tanks are still there. But none of that matters if tankers can't safely reach the island, load their cargo, and leave again without risking a Hellfire missile through the engine room. That's not damage to a building, that's damage to an entire economic system's confidence in its own primary artery. And confidence, once broken in a market this sensitive, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild, even after the guns eventually go quiet. What do you think happens next here? Does Iran manage to keep stretching these alternative routes through the Caspian Sea and Dark Fleet anchorages far enough to offset the damage at Kharg? Or does this slow economic strangulation end up forcing Tehran back to the negotiating table faster than anyone currently expects? Let me know what you think down in the comments. I read through as many of them as I genuinely can. If this video helped you understand exactly why this one small island matters so much to how this entire conflict plays out, do me a favor and hit that like button. It makes a real difference in getting this kind of detailed breakdown in front of more people who need to see it. Go ahead and subscribe if you want to stay on top of how this blockade develops over the coming weeks, because the numbers on this story are shifting practically day to day right now. And if you know someone who's been following the headlines about Iran but hasn't connected the dots on why this particular island keeps coming up again and again, share this with them, because understanding Kharg Island is genuinely understanding the single biggest pressure point in this entire war. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.